off in Ruth 3 going into 4, and we'll work our way a ways into chapter 4 here. We may by the time we're finished here in December take a little glance at Esther, but for the most part we'll launch into Esther then after the first of the year as our next phase of exploring women in the Bible. And just as kind of a preview so that some of you can start thinking a bit about this, the book of Esther, the story of Esther, is the basis for the Jewish festival of Purim. And that's always in the spring. And in 2019, Purim will be on March 20th. That happens to be a Wednesday. We could have our Purim party on the 21st, I suppose, and still be okay. It is a celebration of this story in the book of Esther, and it's often sort of a costume party. People dress up as characters from the book of Esther. Also, there is in some communities a tradition of a certain amount of drinking that's involved as well. And some of the rabbis suggested that the standard, two of the characters in the book of Esther are Haman and Mordecai, the villain and one of the heroes, and the standard that some rabbis propose is that you should drink enough that you can no longer distinguish between Haman and Mordecai. Connie, do you want me to repeat your comment about
bring the wine?
Yeah, Connie said here. So,
Okay, all right.
But
How do you spell Purim or whatever?
Purim.
Oh, okay.
And there are little goodies and delicacies traditionally that come with it, particularly something that's called a hamantasha, and Haman is one of these characters again, but typically they're little triangular baked goodies that have a little filling in them, and you fold the ends up. We'll look at all this after the first of the year.
You need to give us a hand at it.
I will.
Time so we can...
First part of January, yes.
Oh.
I've already thought through all of this. That the climax of the Esther study will be a Purim party, and so you'll have to work hard. But all of that just by way of preview here. So back to Ruth, who there are no parties associated with her.
Barley soup maybe.
We could, yeah, or a little midnight tryst at the threshing floor, or something like that. So, speaking of that, before we go on, I want to catch up on a couple of things that I have maybe mentioned sort of tangentially, but not spoken of completely. And the first of those is the significance that readers of Ruth would take from the fact that important events take place at the threshing floor. There are a couple of places in the Old Testament that are places where seductions and engagements happen. Now, one of those is a well, and the well is a place where several Old Testament engagements happen. Moses meets his future bride there, for example. Jacob and Rachel come across one another there. Meeting at a well, people hear that in stories, and for people familiar with the Hebrew Bible, the first thing they would think of if a man and woman meet at a well, that there's the potential for hanky-panky in the future. which really throws an interesting light on Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. I remember back almost in another lifetime when I was the ecumenical chaplain at the Colorado School of Mines. We had Bible study and had well, they were all very bright people. They all got 1600s on their SATs and were going to be, nuclear engineers. And I mean, it was thoroughly intimidating. But one of these very bright young fellows was a sort of a Buddhist atheist who came to our Bible studies. And we looked at John 4 and the woman at the well, and he said, well, that's obvious what's going on here. This woman is trying to seduce him. She's talking. Well, whether that's actually the case or not, this would be one of the first things that traditional readers would wonder. It's a well, there's a man and a woman, something interesting is going to happen. Much the same is true of threshing floors. As a matter of fact, just when I think maybe I'm not engaged in the most productive profession sometimes, I realize that there's someone who devotes a significant part of life to writing a monograph on the role of threshing floors in the life of ancient Israel, their ritual and symbolic significance. And I think to myself, well, maybe I'm doing something useful after all then. But there was, and actually I did buy it and read it, this fairly extensive monograph on the role of threshing floors in the social life of ancient Israel. Not only do they have a symbolic function, this is where men and women would meet, whether it's for romantic kind of liaisons or more properly for engagement rituals. Mm-hmm. For that to happen on a threshing floor was somewhat expected. So when we read what happens there is Ruth, and she's fairly directive about what happens. Throw your cloak over me. This was probably an engagement ritual that she instructs Boaz in. Again, readers wouldn't be surprised that would happen on a threshing floor. There's an additional and perhaps deeper significance to the threshing floor. Often the threshing floor is regarded as a place that has ritual, as in kind of religious significance as well. That there would be, on many of these threshing floors, there'd be a little shrine, perhaps with where you could make offerings of the first fruits. So that this was a place of prayer and devotion, not just a place of harvest, and the connection between human sexuality and religious ritual in ancient Israel, for example, is not separated. Those realms often go together. In much of the world, fertility, human fertility, animal fertility, the fertility of crops, is not merely a biological thing. This is a religious and spiritual reality. God gives the gift of fertility. As a matter of fact, in Genesis, what is the command to the man and the woman? Be fruitful and multiply, and and populate the earth. And that is part of the vocation, and it's not merely reproductive, but it's part of being a co-creator with God. So to read this encounter at the threshing floor as, on the one hand, having romantic potential, that would be expected. To read it as also a symbolic and religious ritual would also be expected. And don't separate those two things very far from each other either. And the same is true of these encounters at wells. in the same way that God gives fertility and crops, God also gives water. And if you've ever had any experience in a culture where people have to carry water, you start to understand the really important significance of wells. I'll just never forget our time in Tanzania, and they had not in that village yet drilled a well, and so they would walk to the water source and carry fresh water from the water source back to the village. And it was between 1/2 and 3/4 of a mile, so it was relatively close compared to some villages. But it was a nice trip to the water because it was all downhill. But coming back with a 6-gallon bucket, 2/3 full on this woman's head, and having to make that trip sometimes several times a day, you start to attach some pretty high significance to water and to wells and to water sources. When a new well is drilled in Tanzania, this is always a time for a worship service and a blessing. It's not merely a commercial venture, for example. It's not just economic. It's not just plumbing, that's for sure. It's about life. So some of the same kinds of things that go into this. I wanted to make sure that we would touch on that. Now, any thoughts or questions about that? Yeah, Al, please.
Is it a possibility you could be reading something into the story that's not really there?
Always it's a possibility, yes. Like, what do you have in mind?
Well, I was just saying, she was told to meet to go to the thing.
Oh, yeah.
So it doesn't sound like there was an engagement party, because usually engagement is between two different people who agree on something in advance. So.
Yeah, so as Freud would say, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, right, in a dream.
Okay.
Yeah, that's always possible, but I don't think so.
Yeah.
And again, this is interpretation at best. We don't know what the writer's intent was, but the combination of the threshing floor and the cloak and the uncovering and the results of it, I think that at least from Ruth and Naomi's perspective, the intention is fairly clear. More suspicious readers would say the intention is to trap this poor fool by his own honor. I'm not that suspicious. But I do think that it's highly risky on Ruth's part, because Boaz would have been within his rights not only to reject her, but to have her punished for being so forward. Remember, she gives instructions. Here's what you should do. You should put your cloak over me, which in other, Ruth, which in other places in the Old Testament is clearly identified as an engagement ritual. And in Ruth, this is connected to God's covering. Remember, the same word is used for God's wings of protection and Boaz's cloak. And so there's a pretty significant verbal connection there. So certainly, Al, it's true that a cigar may just be a cigar. It just may be a chance meeting, and that's how it worked out. But I'm not persuaded that it's that simple. Other thoughts or comments?
What other opportunities would be possible besides a threshing floor and a well? Would there be any other meeting places? Those were the limited options?
No, these are just
Okay.
places that
Yeah.
that show up repeatedly in the Hebrew Bible as where these things happen. But certainly families that arranged marriages, they'd have parties. They would schedule this. It would be, it would be in probably. If it's a formal contract, the way most of these were, maybe it was out in the public square, but probably it was arranged more intentionally, and there was celebration involved, and so no, these aren't the only places. These are the places where these, the wells and threshing floors are places where these sort of irregular connections are made.
Irregular connection.
Yeah, I don't think that this for Ruth or I mean what's memorable about these is that these are not your typical engagements. I think that is part of the point, and it's very atypical that Ruth, I mean, even if she'd not been a Moabite from Moab, who's a Moabite from Moab, even if she had not been a foreigner, for her to take the initiative like that is unusual, risky, easily misconstrued. So I mean, this is it's irregular in lots of ways. Yeah, Al.
See, I still think that she took it, that Ruth and Naomi took it that Boaz was the next of kin, and that she did there with the intention of becoming pregnant and giving a heir to Elimelech's line, whether Boaz married her or not.
Well, you may be right. There'd be significant. There's several things. There'd be significant advantages to making sure that there's a marriage, as opposed to just a child.
Yeah.
But still, if it's just a child, wouldn't it be because did Judah marry Tamara?
Nope.
After she got pregnant?
Nope. You're right. And the child is still the heir.
So why wouldn't the child still be the heir?
Well, I'm not saying that the child wouldn't be, but there would not be the social stigma. I mean, we don't hear any more. I mean, we know that Tamar produces the twins, and Perez is the older one, and he's the heir. We don't hear any more about sort of the conversations among the women in the kitchen about the kids or anything like that later on. We don't hear about that, but that kind of thing, I mean, that would have been part of the conversation. I mean, think about, Lot's daughters, they take the initiative to make sure that the line continues. And there are children produced, but what's produced is Moab and Ammon. Now, they're children, they're sons, and this is a story then to say why Israel despises Moab and Ammon. So I think that even though these are children, there's some shadow over the legitimacy. So that there would be, I think, social and legal advantages to there being a marriage. But your point that in some cases these levirate marriages and Judah and Tamar, I mean, that's absolutely that's the case. Still keeps the line going.
Well, I was just thinking this.
Yep.
This would keep the line going regardless whether he married her or not, and he decided to marry her, so that much better.
I think that's the point. That much better.
He said you're wrong because there's somebody of closer kin than what I am. So this is not right.
This is a puzzling thing. Did Naomi not know about Joshmo?
I don't know.
It's hard to believe that she didn't.
Oh,
I mean, I am suspicious of that Naomi didn't know that there was this nearer relative. it seems to me virtually certain that she did. I mean, it's not, Bethlehem at this time is not a metropolis. I mean, it's a couple hundred people.
Yeah.
So that the fact that she didn't know this would be surprising at least. And it makes me think, Joe Schmo didn't have much money and Boaz did. And I say Joe Schmo because, the nearer kinsman that we'll read about in chapter 4 is never named. It's this funny little Hebrew label that is best translated as Joe Schmo, because in Hebrew, the two words rhyme with each other as well. So, that's the writer's intention. It doesn't matter who this nearer relative really is.
Oh.
But it's a complication. And it's gonna require a very public negotiation. And that's the other thing that I'd like to talk about a bit here. One of the things that we can observe simply about the roles of men and women, not only in ancient society, but in many cultures, is that by and large, men speak in public and women speak in private. At the city gate, where all of the public business is done, it's the men who do the talking. In the kitchen, it's the women who do the talking. And we see that here. We get to the end of chapter 3, and we never hear Ruth's voice again. That's it. It's Boaz who does the talking. And I think that's descriptive of many cultures, but certainly of Mediterranean culture, that the assumption is that men do the public speaking and women don't. Not that women don't speak, but it's not out in public where business happens and where politics happens and where military battles are fought and that kind of thing. It's one of the revolutionary things in the early Christian church, for example, that in fact women do have public speaking roles, clearly. And that's a pretty subversive kind of thing for the early church to be about. But we see it here in spades in Ruth. Boaz is negotiating with Joe Schmo. Ruth's voice disappears completely. We don't hear from her again. And just that public and private speaking is related to gender. In many cultures, but certainly in Mediterranean culture. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think her influence was still there, but then that's.
Which her? Ruth or?
Ruth's influence, women's influence.
We will hear from the women of Bethlehem, that sort of Greek chorus in the background. We'll hear a little bit from Naomi. But in chapter 4, Ruth really disappears. Her voice is not heard. Once she's produced a kid, the baby is presented to Naomi. It's worth reflecting and talking some more as we go along about where does Ruth go? What happens to her? So let's have at it here in chapter 4 as we move. Remember, at the end of chapter 3, Ruth has returned from the threshing floor with as much barley as any human being could be expected to carry. It's enough to feed him for a while, which is a good thing because the harvest is over. Ruth's not going to be going out to do threshing again. The harvest is done. And they don't know how it's going to turn out. Naomi says to Ruth in chapter 3, verse 18, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." Mm-hmm. And so we continue. No sooner, yeah, it's right, it's going to happen soon. No sooner had Boaz gone up to the gate and sat down there, and this is the gate to the village of Jerusalem. And it's fairly typical that negotiations of various kinds would happen in the city gate. That was a typical place where business transactions would happen. So this is consistent with the culture. No sooner had Boaz gone up to the gate and sat down there than the next of kin. Now we need to stop for a minute here. The NRSV has a little footnote there. And those little footnotes are a reason why you should keep a magnifying glass with your Bible at all times. Because, holy cow, there's a little mark on the page there. But if you go down to the bottom or wherever your footnotes are, it's not next of kin. This is this Hebrew term goel, the one with the right to redeem. This is not just about family relationship. This is about legal relationship. Okay, so no sooner had Boaz gone up to the gate and sat down there, than the one with the right to redeem, of whom Boaz had spoken, came passing by. We get this repeatedly in Ruth, right? I mean, it so happened that something took place, or by chance, or it just seemed there was not a meeting scheduled. He's passing by. He just happens to be passing by. Translators of the Bible will talk about something called the divine passive. Many times verbs will be in the passive voice and the actor is not identified. And many times when things are in the passive voice, that's because it's God who's working. And they don't want to name God directly because they don't want to risk taking God's name in vain. Well, so here is a kind of literary divine passive, I think. You know, Joe Schmo was just happened to be passing by. Well, so who made that happen? I think in the context of Ruth, it's fairly clear this is God working again in the background to make sure that things happen. Yeah. Now, it's always good to have a little skepticism. It may just be that it was an accident. But I think that the writer's intention is to say, you know, God is working here. So, came passing by. So, Boaz said, "Come over, friend, sit down here." And he went over and sat down. Then Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. 'Tis convenient that everyone necessary for the transaction is available.
Yes. 10 men of the elders.
Yeah. Now, why 10 men? The rabbis would call this a minyan or a quorum. 10 men were required to constitute a legal quorum for decisions like this. And so everything is going to be done by the book. The legal quorum of elders of the town are available, and they're going to witness this transaction and ratify it. So Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. He then said to the next of kin, the one with the right to redeem, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our kinsman Elimelech." Now finally we get a little clarity here. It appears that that some of the land that had belonged to Elimelech had remained in the immediate family, and Naomi was free then to dispose of it. Okay, which we hadn't known previously. Why didn't Ruth go and harvest on that? Well, maybe they hadn't planted it. Yeah, Al.
That isn't Naomi's land.
It's Elimelech's land.
it belonged to Elimelech in the past.
Yeah.
Somebody else had it
That
and it was up for
belonged
sale.
That's
That's the way I read it.
That belonged,
That it was Elimelech's land in the
Oh.
past, somebody else bought it,
belonged
and
to,
now it's up for sale, and since the family is the first right to buy it, according to Jewish law,
That's correct. No.
they can she can buy it back and make it Elimelech's land again,
Can she buy land?
huh?
Can she buy?
Well,
Because of-
whoever buys it is buying Elimelech's
Buy it.
land.
in the presence of the city.
But her, since she is the heir, Elimelech's heir, she's got first right to buy the
Can
land.
a woman buy land?
I do not know.
Well, I think, Al, that you're probably right, that that's what has happened. We should send you to rabbinical school, I think. Because,
No, it's
I think that's
I read
right.
it. I
Yeah.
didn't read it the way you guys read it.
No, I think you're quite right,
I
that
read
that's the more likely.
Because they were gone for 10 years. Somebody
Yep.
had to buy it. and
So it
burn
comes on the market,
Okay,
and there is, and now to Connie's question,
wait,
there is then this legal responsibility that falls to the next of kin, the Goel, the Redeemer, to restore that land then to Elimelech's family. So Naomi is not in a position to buy it, first of all, economically, but also I think legally as well. It's the obligation of the Redeemer to then restore that land. You know, see, I mean, this is the discussion that Boaz and Joshmo are having. Are you going to buy that land for Naomi? Now, we'll talk about and we can think about what that means to buy that land for Naomi, because clearly it doesn't mean buy it and hand it over to her. That's not Joshmo's intention. That's not what attracts him about it. But technically and legally, that is what's going to happen, because Joshmo knows that when there's an heir that's produced, then that heir will inherit that land. It won't stay part of Joshmo's property. He won't be able to bequeath that land to his heirs. It goes to Elimelech's heirs. Does that make sense? And I think you're right, Al. That's right.
When he first thought of it, he was going to buy the land.
Mhm.
Joshua was going to buy the
Mhm.
land because he didn't think about Naomi or Ruth. He just wanted the land because he was a relative, and being a relative, he's got first right to buy it. Then he finds out that there's heirs attached to it.
And then he's no longer interested. Well,
Then suddenly,
he's
not quite so interested.
not as interested.
Yeah, because suddenly, whoa.
He becomes completely uninterested when he realizes that there's a wife attached to it as
Right.
well. So, yeah, it becomes less attractive as his obligations increase. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think we have a clearer picture. I think that's right. It comes on the market. There's this obligation that Joshmo can't get out of if he buys it. And that is that he's beholden to Elimelech's family by law, and that this comes with both the inheritance problem and the wife problem. And, so does Boaz know in advance that this guy's not going to be interested in this? Well, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. But it's singularly unattractive to Joshmo. He's interested to begin with, and but it doesn't take very long. Let's read through that. So he said to the next, verse 3, he said to the next of kin, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling. No, Al, it doesn't say that this,
parcel of
she's
land
selling the land.
that belonged
Is
to our
what?
kinsman.
She's selling the parcel of land that belonged to our kinsman Elimelech. That Naomi is selling it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, see, she had, so this land, no, I think that's right. This land had somehow stayed in, had not gone
Stayed
to
in her
anybody
use.
else. Well, in her name.
Oh,
I mean, was it abandoned while they were gone, or I mean, I don't know. But she's selling it.
okay.
So she's selling this parcel of land, which maybe is next to Joe Schmo's property. You know, these are not huge tracts of land. These are little pieces. Always good to add land, you know, that's close to yours. Maybe it was close to his, but she's selling it. If you buy it, Joe, if you buy it, you know, you're the nearest relative. You really are obliged. You should buy it, and make sure that it stays in Elimelech's line. You should do that. You understand, you know, and now Boaz tightens the screws a little bit, right? You understand it won't go to your heirs, and there's this woman who comes with it.
You were acquiring Ruth the Moabite.
That's right. Notice, you know, this, if Joe Schmo ends up with Ruth, this is a property transaction. You acquire Ruth just like you acquire the land.
And Naomi.
Wait,
And Naomi. I don't think so. Responsibility for Naomi, yes.
not part of the purchase.
Yeah,
right?
but not, but, you know, marriage in ancient Israel is a property contract. Well, adultery in ancient Israel is a property crime. It's a theft. It is one man stealing the sexual property of another man. That's what adultery is. And we can see it here. You buy the land, you buy the woman too.
But in chapter 3, it was like Naomi kind of owned Ruth because she said, you will lay down with him, you know, you will do this. I mean, Ruth had a choice or not. I don't, you know.
You know, Ruth had made really a covenant with Naomi. You know, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. Where you go, I will go. Ruth had bound herself to Naomi as daughter to mother. And I think in this cultural context, the mother could say to the daughter, as the father could say to the son, this is what you will do. And that's how it would be. Otherwise, the parent is dishonored, the relationship is significantly broken. So no, parents could do that. Well, when parents arranged marriages, right? Here's who you're going to marry. I don't know that person. You know, what does that have to do with anything? You know, now we're back to Fiddler on the Roof, right? Tevye and Golda met each other on their wedding day. And 25 years later, Tevye is singing, do you love me? And Golda is saying, what are you talking about? What does that have to do with it?
And Neil Diamond's father ripped off his shirt.
So that Hebrew word for acquire, I mean, it's the same word, same verb you'd use to acquire a thing, to acquire property. Yeah, Al.
So, in a sense, what's happening is Naomi is selling this land,
Yeah,
all right? And then with the land goes Ruth, who is going to bear a child who's going to be given back to Naomi, and her heirs still inherit the land. So she hasn't lost anything.
And what's in it for Joe?
it's win-win for her.
you know, this is Boaz's point, right? What's in it for you, Joe? I mean, so you do the right thing. That'd be great. But here's the law. And besides, when you acquire Ruth, you aren't responsible for her upkeep. That's how this works. And you know, maybe that's more than you want to take on. Yeah, Connie.
Acquire her as a piece of property, not necessarily as a wife.
Well, I'm not sure there's a distinction.
What if he already has a wife?
Oh, well, if you could afford more than one,
You could have more than one?
well, Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines. It's good to be king.
Greedy.
Wow.
Well, many of those, you know, I mean, we live in, you know, kind of a hypersexualized culture, and we wonder, you know, how in the world Solomon had time for anything else. Well, that's not really how it worked.
Didn't he inherit David's wives after David
Yeah.
died?
Yeah.
So that was
Belonged
part of
to
the
it.
300. He inherited those
Yeah.
wives.
And these are political relationships.
Okay.
More than any, for the king, these are political
Yeah.
relationships to cement alliances with other rulers. I mean, really, those women were, well, I don't know if they were condemned or subjected to, but you know, they basically were remanded over to life in the harem, and that was that. Now, on a smaller scale here, if Joe Schmo had been relatively well off and could support more than one wife, that may well have been within the letter of the law. In the very next book, for example, in Samuel, we run into a family where there are 2 wives. Yeah, Hannah, who is Samuel's mother, is the junior wife of the 2 and is unable to produce a son, and that's a problem. So no, I don't think polygamy would have been, and it would have been polygyny. That wouldn't have been a roadblock.
Even to the first wife?
Well, now we have to separate out the law and psychology. Legally, it would not have been a roadblock. Would it have created stress for the other wife or wives? May well have, and
Which could have created stress for Joe Schmo.
could. Or Joe Schmo says, like many men in such a setting, not my problem. Work it out. Right. Yeah. I mean that. Now, the story in 1 Samuel is unusual in the fact that Elkanah, the husband, is actually distressed by Hannah's distress. Well, we'll come back to that. That will be worth looking at, that relationship. But no, polygyny would not be a barrier to this. And if these sister wives can't get along, you know, don't come and tell me about it. I have important things to worry about. Yeah, so no, I don't think that would be an issue. The bigger issue is there enough property, is there enough prospect to justify taking on the additional responsibility? You know, because the husband is responsible for the upkeep of the wife or wives and all the children that are produced. And I think Joe Schmo does a little calculation and says, "Oh boy, no, this is not gonna pencil out." Which Boaz clearly, I think, knows. And for Boaz, there's more than property at stake here. I mean, that's been part of the story. We know that. We know that there is that Boaz is not acquiring Ruth. That Boaz wants a relationship with Ruth, wants a marriage more in terms, I think, of what we would see. So let's see, where are we at? Naomi, who's come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our kinsman Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. Redeem it means restore it to Elimelech's line, ultimately. But if you will not, tell me so that I may know, for there is no one prior to you to redeem it, and I come after you. So Boaz is an honorable man, letter of the law. He's not going to jump the line, and so they have this public negotiation. So Joshua says, I will redeem it. You know, this is his first response. He's going to buy the land. Okay. And then Boaz says, are you sure? The day you acquire the field from the land of Naomi, you are also acquiring Ruth. Ruth the Moabite. Remember, in all of chapter 3, we didn't hear that Ruth was from Moab. Now we're back to it. Is Boaz now raising the ante a little bit? Not only are you going to get this woman, but it's this foreigner, for crying out loud. I don't know, but possibly. This is not the most flattering description here, right? Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance. Yeah, this is not designed to persuade Joe Schmo that he should buy it. Here are all the liabilities.
These are the bad things.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
At this, the next of kin, that is the one with the right of redemption, said, I cannot redeem it for myself without damaging my own inheritance. I'm going to invest this money in this land, and I'm going to take on this wife, and it's not going to go to my heirs. By law, it can't. It's going to go to whatever heir gets produced from Elimelech's line. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Cannot, will not, whatever.
Does he know at this point that Ruth and Boaz have been together?
It doesn't appear so in the story.
Because otherwise, if he and Ruth produce an heir,
You could write for Downton Abbey, you know.
if he and Ruth produce an heir, it would stay.
This could have gotten really complicated.
So has he heard that there was a little
It
roll
doesn't.
in the hay?
Well, it doesn't appear so. I mean, I think that's part of the writer's intention. These things happen bang, bang, bang.
Yeah, well, she left.
No
before
pun
it became
intended, of
light.
course.
She left before it came light.
Oh.
He goes down, when it becomes light, goes down to the city gate. So, as his wife talked to the other ladies and then talked to him to let him know that somebody saw her going back from someplace, probably not.
Probably not.
With enough time.
Yeah.
However, that does not necessarily mean she's with child.
Who's the child?
Ruth.
Ruth.
But
She
we-
might not
we-
be- it's the next day. You don't know if she's
Yeah.
pregnant
No.
or not.
We don't even know if they slept together.
Yeah.
There you go.
And down
I
in
thought
verse
they did.
13,
Well, I think so, but we don't know.
Oh, okay.
down in verse 13, if you just follow chapter 4, it sounds like then they,
They
so
got married.
Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. I mean, if you didn't have chapter 3 ahead of it.
Some scholars are convinced that the Book of Ruth is two stories that are kind of sewn together, and that verse 13 really picks up from the latter part of chapter 3, for example, that But this is one of the places where the stitching together the two stories is not as artful as it might have been. I don't know if that's the case, but you can see a kind of a seam in the story there. Although it's a logical progression in terms of the events. I think that Connie, the writer, is very intentional about saying that things happen just immediately, and that there wasn't time for Joe Schmo to have enough information to realize that he's being played a little bit. Because, Boaz does an excellent job of selling Joe on the downside of this arrangement, that there are lots of disadvantages for him. But I'm a good guy. I'll take her off your hands.
But the other thing is Joe Schmo could have had a wife already, because it said it would damage his inheritance. So that makes me wonder, did he already have another wife and children?
I think, we can't be certain, but I think that's likely.
So they would have come first.
No, Ruth's child would have come first once he bought
Yeah,
her parcel. So his children
But-
would have been put down
but if
here.
he'd have married Ruth, if he had gotten Ruth pregnant, this Joe Schmo, then where would that have?
Well, we're in the area of speculation there, but one possibility, let's assume that Joe Schmo does what the law requires, buys the land, takes Ruth as a wife, in addition to one or more of the others, produces a child or children, and then dies and then dies. Would the law require that this child or children that he had with Ruth would be entitled to some of the inheritance from his pre-existing property? I think that there's a fair chance of that, and he's not willing to take what he has and have it further divided among more children, especially children who already have their own inheritance and, through Elimelech, and are actually going to come out better than his own kids. Yeah.
Or it could take 3/4 of what the amount of money he has right now to buy the land. And then he could not recoup that 3/4 before he died from the profit from the land, because that land is gonna go, so his heirs would wind up with less.
With less than they had, yep.
Wind up with less.
Yeah, in any event, I think that's the concern. I think it's likely that he's married and has one or more children already, and that the only outcome for his children from that first marriage, the only outcome possible for them is that they would have less in one way or another. So I think that's right. And Boaz doesn't have to make that any worse. That's just the deal. So, next of kin, verse 6, I cannot redeem it for myself without damaging my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Okay. So, now we know how it's going to turn out. Now there's another ceremony that is part of this. And before we read it, let me say in advance, no one is clear about what this really means, this sandal ceremony.
There you go, I guess we.
There you go, yeah.
Right.
So you should feel free to let your speculation, there are dissertations that have been written about this. So now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one took off a sandal and gave it to the other. This was the manner of attesting in Israel. So, when the next of kin, the one with the right of redemption, said to Boaz, acquire it for yourself, he took off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have acquired from the hand of Naomi Yeah. You know, it belonged to Naomi. From the hand of Naomi, all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance, in order that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his kindred and from the gate of his native place. Today you are witnesses. Okay, let's stop there and talk a little bit about this. Let's see. Sandals. Even though the NRSV makes a decision about who removes the sandal, that it is, what is it? It's Joshmo who takes off his sandal and hands it to Boaz. The Hebrew's not that clear. It's not clear who actually does it. Not that important, really, but it's not that clear. Scholars really aren't sure what it actually means, and it depends on where your imagination takes you, I suppose. There are some similar practices in surrounding cultures, but some scholars quite seriously propose that this is a very graphic way of suggesting that Joshmo is sort of uninserting himself from Ruth's life and other things.
I never heard that word, and here they call it de-insert.
Well, I
mean,
maybe I made that
I
up,
like
but
uninsert, that's fine.
but
Yeah, that's good.
yeah. Yeah, I don't know how much of a graphic, physical metaphor this is supposed to be, but some scholars wonder if that's part of what it means. It may be, and I think this is more likely, frankly, it may be that this is an expression of the solemnity of the contract, the seriousness of it. Moses is tending sheep, and he sees a bush on fire up on the hill, and it doesn't stop burning, and up he goes to take a look at it. The voice of the Lord speaks from the bush, and the first thing that the voice of the Lord says to Moses is, "Take off your shoes, for you are standing on holy ground." It could be that removing a shoe is a way of demonstrating that this is a solemn, not only solemn, but that it is a holy ritual. Whenever there's a covenant or contract in ancient Israel, I mean, there are the 10 elders here who are witnessing, but the most important witness to any covenant is God.
Mm-hmm.
Your footnote at the bottom refers to Deuteronomy 25:7-11, and when I went back to read that, it explains that taking off the sandal a little more.
It's not clear, and we should take a look at that. The question is whether this story in Ruth predates the Deuteronomy text or comes after it. Yeah, that's part of kind of just the textual challenge. But yeah, thanks for that, Carol. Let's go ahead and look at that. If you turn to Deuteronomy 25. And what did I put down here for 7 to 11? Oh, 25. I was looking at 24. There we go. Now, it's interesting that this is a description of the levirate marriage law that we talked about previously. So, start at verse 5, and we'll work our way into this. So, Deuteronomy 25. When brothers reside together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in to her. Now, neither of these are the husband's brother, but these are the closest relatives. Shall go in to her, taking her in marriage and performing the duty of a husband's brother to her. The firstborn whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the deceased brother, so that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. That's almost a quote of what Boaz says. That's certainly part of the connection. But if the man has no desire to marry his brother's widow, then the brother's widow shall go up to the elders at the gate. But notice it's Boaz who's speaking, not the widow in Ruth. My husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. The elders of the town shall summon him and speak to him. If he persists, but notice here, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, pull his sandal off his foot, spit in his face, and declare, this is what is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. Throughout Israel, his family shall be known as the house of him whose sandal was pulled off. So, while there are actions that are similar, this is a quite different transaction than what we read in Ruth. In the Deuteronomic law, this is a method of shaming the brother who refuses to do his duty. And pulling off a shoe, remember, feet are sometimes a euphemism for genitals. And so removing a man's shoe this is a highly offensive, dishonoring thing to do. And then to spit in his face besides. So Deuteronomy 25 is not this sort of pleasant civil transaction that we find in Ruth chapter 4. The only thing that's really similar is that somebody's shoe gets taken off. So on the one hand, Carol, there's a connection, and certainly Boaz's language about what's going to happen and why, there's a connection, but something quite different has taken place here. So scholars really, they just wonder, they debate, okay, what is the connection? Is one earlier than, does Ruth, the Ruth story represent an earlier or a later understanding of this? And we don't know. I mean, scholars debate that. Is Boaz choosing to derail this kind of thing and not expose the next of kin to that public ridicule because Boaz has already gotten what he wants? That could be. We don't know. We don't know what would make sense in the context of the story.
But in Deuteronomy, if the sandal has been transferred one way or another, does she then have that property? The elders are there, they've witnessed it, she's taken the sandal, rather than being given to her, because by her right, it belongs to her.
The removing of the sandal is not claiming of property as such. It's shaming that brother who won't do his duty. I mean, part of the result of this is that then the woman is freed either to go to the next brother or to someone outside of the direct family line. But most of all, the emphasis in Deuteronomy 25, I mean, it's a remarkable thing what the widow gets to do. But the emphasis is on the shame of the man who simply who won't do his duty. And so this woman who has been wronged demonstrates that by uncovering his nakedness. even if it's a foot. We always have to remember that shoes and feet are, in Middle Eastern culture, these are locations of honor and shame. You might remember when the second President Bush had a news conference was it in Iraq? And somebody threw a shoe at him. Well, we think, goodness sakes, wouldn't Iraq have been better? I mean, no, this is as disrespectful as you could be to throw a shoe at someone in that culture. For that woman to remove that man's shoe, I mean, if she had just done that sort of unilaterally out in the street, he could have killed her.
Oh.
And was the law different? I mean, like, because in the New Testament, you know, the men could go in the square and go, I don't know how many circles, and say, I divorce this woman.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she's a widow, so she doesn't have that right to have him do that. I mean, was this the only way, by shaming him, she could be free to
get
marry?
free from that process? This is what I think the law is written for this situation specifically, so that there is this kind of relief. It's legal relief for the widow, who otherwise she's got no recourse otherwise. She's stuck in the system. And, you know, this takes us back to Tamar and Judah. Apparently, Tamar doesn't get to do this because, you know, one brother, no deal, you know, Onan, forget it, I'm not producing a kid. And so then Tamar is reduced to tricking her father-in-law. So clearly these regulations are not related to that or come after that. But yes, this is legal and social relief for the widow. It is not the woman who is to be shamed in this transaction. I mean, otherwise the man could easily say, hey, you know, she's ugly, I don't want her. I mean, you know, to make it the victim's problem. Here is a place where the widow is empowered to have legal and social relief. She's the honorable one, and the man who refuses is the one who is shamed.
But
Yeah.
she's shamed first.
She's been damaged, certainly. I mean, to be a widow was to...
She's shamed by the fact that
He won't do it. Absolutely.
do it.
She has lost her status by being widowed.
Which then empowers her to shame him back.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, she offloads that social stigma then onto the man, and she's freed, potentially at least, to find other ways
to the next brother.
The next brother, or if there
And
isn't
if
a
he does
brother.
the same thing, she's shamed again, then she gets to shame him, then she goes to the next brother.
The family's house of him
Wow.
being Sandal was pulled off.
Wow.
That's what they,
Yeah.
they had their sandals pulled off. That's right.
I'm sure that the community hopes that this is.
Like the Black Widow.
That's good.
Well, when we think about Judah and Tamar, I mean, this is Judah's concern.
Yeah,
You know, I mean, you know, Judah is not willing to put any more sons at risk. You know, I mean, you marry Tamar and you die. Apparently, he's just not going to do that. And I think that in that culture there would have been that thought that, you know, holy cow, she's already buried two of them. I'm not risking a third son. And so then what relief legally and socially does Tamar have? You know, she takes it upon herself in much the same way that Ruth and Naomi sort of take it upon themselves. They're unusual in that way.
yeah.
So there's a connection, Carol, but it is sort of a tenuous one. The relationship is really quite reversed. And Joe Schmo, he may have been publicly embarrassed in the city gate because, you know, he did say first, yep, I'll buy it. And then Boaz said, you know, are you sure? And then he said, oh, no. So maybe there was a little embarrassment, but he does not go through this shaming ritual. which, I mean, I just can't I can't imagine the social stigma of having this woman pull off your shoe and spit in your face and hang you with this name for your family that goes with you to your grave. I mean, the penalty for the man is significant, you know, as it should be in terms of this culture. But it is significant. I suspect that there would have been people who simply would never have done business with this guy again, for example. Because impurity, you know, this is a purity-impurity culture too. I mean, impurity rubs off. Shame and dishonor rub off. You know, you could become contaminated. So Boaz is an honorable man. We see that throughout. He's no dummy either. He knows how to make the system work. But Boaz clearly doesn't need to shame anyone else in order to be an honorable man. For him, it's not a zero-sum game. He figures out how to make it work without subjecting anybody to further shame. And is, I mean, Boaz is admirable throughout, without question. And depending on how you read it, it may be that Boaz is the hero, rather than just sort of an unwitting tool in the whole thing. So that's as far as we'll get today. Any last thoughts here? Yep, Al.
Do you know what a Jewish woman's favorite wine is?
Do you want me to turn things off
No,
first?
no,
Here, no,
it's
okay.
fine.
It's fine, huh?
Her favorite wine is, I'm gonna live in Florida.
If any of our synagogue friends are watching, I'm not responsible for that.
Somebody else, I did.
Well, that's where the joke came from. So.
Yeah.
So next time we will finish up chapter 4 and start to have some conversation about, you know, what we may have learned or drawn from reading the Book of Ruth. Probably we'll get at least an initial whack at Esther on the 20th. Let's not meet the Thursday after Christmas, the 27th. But then we'll pick it up then the first Thursday in January. And that'll give me a little time to develop a few more things on Esther. So yeah, but if you want to read ahead on Esther, it's a little longer than Ruth. Feel free. Lots of details in there that are worth tracking down. So go ahead and have at that.
Well, this book itself has a lot of details compared to some books in the Bible.
Well, Ruth is this is a masterful story. This is, you know, is it soap opera? Is it social commentary? Is it, you know, what is it? And this is, for next week, this is something to think about. What's it doing in the Bible? I'm not saying it shouldn't be there, but why is it there?
Butter, a pound of
Why is it
butter,
why is it in the Bible?
and a half a cup of light carrot.
And I think that's worth thinking about. Alrighty, thank you, everybody.
Boil that for 5 minutes.
Those were good.